Thank you, Josie. Next up, we're going to hear about the bat mitigation and monitoring plan, a collaborative approach to improving bat mitigation outcomes by Jill Carpenter with LSA Associates.
Good morning, everybody. Is this on? Hello? Okay. I'm not a morning person, so I'm trying to like be awake.
We're back in California.
Yeah, I'm like still sleeping, and I'm on California time. So this is sort of, Josie's talk was an excellent sort of segue into this because I'm going to be talking about bat mitigation and monitoring plans. The plans I'm talking about are going to be plans that are created specifically for individual projects, right? Individual projects that could include a single bridge, or they could include a multitude of bridges for larger project areas. And for those of you who are not familiar with bats roosting in bridges, they can roost in a variety of transportation structures, like the expansion joints. I mean, Josie kind of showed some of this already. Culverts, in closed concrete box girder bridges. They can be using the lost deck. I don't know if you're supposed to use air quotes with the lost deck, but the lost deck is the inside of the bridge, access through those vent holes there, and the bats will fly up into the vent holes and use the interior bridge space, which is essentially a huge cave. And then the swallow nest there as well. I get two in one on that photo. The bats, as she mentioned, fairy martin nests, they'll use swallow nests as well. So you can have bats in, and this is not inclusive of all parts of bridges and culverts that bats can use. This is just sort of a representative sampling because I've got a lot to cover. But just gives you an idea of where bats might be in bridges. And so if you need to do construction on these structures, obviously you need to figure out how to do that without harming the bats. And so why do you want to do that? Well, there are environmental regulations and commitments you might have, depending on where you are. Those vary. In California, we have regulations that protect individual bats as well as colonies of bats, particularly maternity colonies of bats. There's also environmental commitments. There may not be laws, but like the Federal Highway Administration and Caltrans have environmental stewardship sort of standards. Also, just because, not just because you have to do it, but also loss of roosting habitat is a threat for many bat species. Bats are declining worldwide, and roosting habitat is one of the big reasons. And then also something to consider is, you know, there could be other impacts to bats, cumulative impacts from multiple construction projects. There could be indirect impacts like noise and light that could affect bats as well. So we need to like take these things into consideration. Another thing to remember that's really important when looking at bat use of bridges and other parts of the landscape is that bats are not one monolith, right? They're actually quite variable in their ecology and their natural history. And so when you're going to look at impacts to bats from a project, you need to consider not only that not only are not all the bridges the same, but not all the bats are the same. And how they're using the structures is not necessarily the same. And while this picture shows some bats that actually some of these species don't use bridges, I just wanted to show you 6 species in California and how different they even just look, right? So they don't all look the same, they don't all act the same. So it's just something to keep in mind that we can't be looking at this as like a monolith. So why would we want to create these mitigation and monitoring plans? So this is going to have site-specific guidance, which will help in permit preparation. If your permits, environmental permits, have not yet been created, this will allow you to create, prior to that permit coming out, you'll have very specific guidance to create the permit language. If the permit's already been written for the project, you can refine the existing permit language through this. We often do this. I'll have a permit that has very generic sort of boilerplate language. We'll take that and we'll say, look, you know, the permit says this, but our plan is actually going to recommend this instead, because this is actually more applicable to the bridge, to the type of construction, to the species present, to the use of the bridge by that. It also is going to give you extra time. You're going to be doing this well in advance of your project. So you'll be able to incorporate best available knowledge to provide the actual appropriate roosting habitat or mitigation for what's going on. Another great thing is it's going to provide clear direction prior to the project being ready to list. One of the big issues with environmental, one of the big hurdles for the environmental process is that sometimes the project goes to list and the bats haven't been either identified or the impacts haven't been adequately assessed, and then it adds to the cost of the project because the contractor bids on the project unaware of what they have to do. When these plans are written well in advance of this, then it goes to listing, the contractor knows what they're bidding on, they know they have to do these things, and it saves money. It also encourages early agency coordination between the DOT, between the wildlife agencies, between the biologists. There's just so many reasons why having these plans is important. So I'm going to get into the framework. Essentially, this is a sort of generic table of contents. You know, you have your sort of natural history regulatory framework, a project description. Josie mentioned this. This is extremely important that you have a really accurate description of the project and what is going to happen. If they forget to leave out things like we're dumping rocks, or I actually specifically asked a contractor once, like, what are you doing to the bridge? Oh, we're widening. What else are you doing? We're doing nothing. I was looking at the plans. I was like, you're doing a retrofit, a seismic retrofit. He's like, yeah, so what? I said, you're drilling through the joints, which is where the bats are. He was like, oh yeah. So it's like super important to like get like actual knowledge of what's happening. And then I had an engineer actually tell me in that meeting, he goes, oh, you know a lot about concrete T-beam bridges for a biologist. And I was like, well, I have to. So, because of idiots. No, I'm just kidding. But so at any rate, so then, you know, focus surveys, analysis of impacts, what your strategies are going to be to mitigate those impacts. I like to use the word strategy instead of measure, because measure implies something that you can copy and paste. I call them Franken measures. People will sometimes copy and paste like totally unrelated things and create bizarre measures that make no sense. I like to call them strategies, because that's really what it is. We're taking these projects on a project by project basis. We're coming up with a strategy to minimize those impacts. And so I'm going to kind of go through this real quick. The California BAT Working Group endorses the idea of not doing pre-construction surveys for a project, but doing surveys well in advance of project construction, 1 to 2 years at least, so that you can find out if you have maternity roosts, and that you have adequate time to analyze and mitigate, analyze those impacts and mitigate those impacts. And both of these documents can be found at that link right there. I'm not fancy enough for QR codes. And then this document here, if you haven't seen it, is amazing. Caltrans BAT Mitigation Manual. This is an update to the 2004 version. This came out in 2019. It talks about surveys, mitigation, BAT plans. There's a sample BAT plan in the appendix. So these are great resources, but they both talk about doing these surveys 1 to 2 years in advance of construction. And what do those surveys entail? It entails a habitat assessment, going out and seeing what's out there during the day. Merchant surveys at night with some acoustics to kind of support that. And then once you know that you have BAT, you know you need to have one of these plans written. You're going to be looking at your impacts analysis. You need to know what species you have. How are they using it? Is it during the summer only? Is it during the summer and the winter? In California, we have year-round use of bridges by bats. Some of the bridges might only be used during one season or another. Some of them might be used year-round. It depends, but we have bats all times of the year in California. What kind of work are they doing? Is it like maintenance, bridge joint stuff? Is it going to be widening the bridge? Is it going to be replacing the bridge? We need to know that. And then of course, those little details like the seismic retrofit. Time of year and duration of construction. Some of these projects are relatively short. They might just be a few months, depending on the nature of the work. Some of them might be a few years if it's a large bridge and they're widening it or replacing it. What are the impacts to the roosting habitat? So is it temporary? Are they going to be maybe temporarily evicted from their roost and then allowed back in afterwards? Or is it going to be permanent, in which the structure or even just the roost feature might be destroyed or altered? And then something else to consider is actually the impacts to the adjacent foraging habitat. This isn't talked about enough, but you can save the roost. And if the foraging habitat is obliterated, the bats have lost the roost. They can't use it anymore. And so going into those strategies, one of the main ways I like to do it is to minimize or even avoid the direct and indirect impacts through planning the work outside of when the bats are there. Now, if the bats are there year round, obviously you can't do that, but then you try to do it at a time when it's going to minimize impacts the most, and avoiding that maternity season is extremely important. You're going to determine if eviction exclusion is necessary, includes how close is the work to the bats, what season are they going to be doing the work, and if you're evicting them, you need to provide them something else to use. Again, the roosts are a very limited resource on the landscape, and you want to avoid net loss of roosting habitat. If you can retain the existing features, that's ideal. If you cannot, you want to provide them something that has demonstrated effectiveness. Putting something that just like might work isn't good enough, right? You need to have something that actually they will use. You need to monitor it to make sure that they're using it, because if it doesn't work, it's not mitigation. So just some general strategies. There could be additional survey work that's mentioned in the plan, recommended, like maybe you need more information about how they're using it in the winter or whatever else. You want to detail seasonal restrictions, like, okay, they can't work from May to October or something like that, or from April to August. You want to think about bird exclusion if they're trying to keep swallows from using the nests. Again, the bats are using the swallow nests, so we want to make sure that that takes that into account. They're not just spraying them down and not recognizing the bats could be in there. Minimizing vegetation removal and light overspill. Talking about eviction exclusion, if it's warranted or not warranted, and how that's going to happen. And also monitoring of bats during and after construction. If we allow the bats to remain in part of the bridge while they're working on another part of the bridge, then we want to kind of check in on those bats and make sure they're okay. After construction, if you've done anything to their habitat, you need to monitor it and make sure that they're able to continue to use their roosts. And so just kind of talk about humane eviction exclusion a little bit. It's not always necessary on these projects. There's sort of a knee-jerk reaction like, oh, we have a construction project, let's kick out the bats. There's more and more evidence that this is actually quite a severe impact to the bats, to kick them out of their roost, even if it's for a short time, depending on the nature of the work, right? I mean, if they're they're blowing up the bridge, you have to kick them out, right? But if they're working adjacent to where the bats are, you can often, or like Josie was saying, you might be able to have them in one part, move them over, and then let them work over here. There are different ways to deal with that. But eviction exclusion should not be like your knee-jerk reaction, because this can have some severe effects. And you can completely, oftentimes, like I've had bridges where the bats are only there in the winter, and you just have them work the other time of the year, and then it doesn't affect the bats actually at all. However, the seasonal restrictions to avoid this do require planning, and that goes back into the early preparation of the plan. It goes into the bidding document, so the contractors are super aware that, hey, you can't work here from this time to this time. And here's a couple quick examples of some bridges where that happened. The upper left one, they just did it in the fall and winter, and they completely avoided the maternity season, which is when the bats were there. So we didn't have to exclude them. The bats weren't there. Here's another culvert where the duration of work at this culvert, there's a channel work, culvert extension. It was too long to avoid the maternity season. So we just only let them do certain types of things during the maternity season that didn't create a lot of noise. And we also provided them alternate roosting habitat bolted onto they were only working at one end. So we put it on this end. The bats moved into this on their own when the construction was happening, had their babies there, everything was fine. And then in this last one, again, they couldn't avoid the maternity season completely, so we didn't let them pile drive, we didn't let them do demo, and they were only working on one end. So we just provided them habitat at the other end. They moved into it themselves, and actually they stayed there after construction was done. So, so that was great. Another thing we do, like I said, you might have some activities that are happening during the maternity season. We'll monitor the noise. We'll keep an eye on the bats. Sort of spoiler alert and shameless plug. I'm hoping in 2 years, I'm working on a noise study right now of construction noise in Caltrans, and I'm hoping to provide some cool information about how construction noise is affecting bats in a couple of years. So stay tuned for ICOET 2027. Here's some roosting habitat mitigation. Josie showed you some great examples. These are also bolt-on concrete panels that you can bolt onto the sides of the culverts. You can bolt them into the closure pores of bridges. I did a poster at ICOET in 2019 that looked at temperature and how the bats are using these bolt-on panels, and sort of long story short, where you put them on a bridge actually affects the type of use. So maternity colonies like them up in the girders where it traps heat, it's more stable. The bats in the fall and in the winter tend to like them more in the open where the temperatures are a little bit less stable, but also cooler. And so this paper, and I'm happy to send this to anyone, this poster who wants to see it. Here's building it into the bridge. So when we have a bridge replacement, we can also create bridge plans that build habitat into the bridge. And so here are sort of the key takeaways. Oh, wow, I went through that really fast. I usually go long, so I was really worried. So the key takeaways here is, this kicks off the coordination early on, and this is key, right? You have not the contractor on board yet, but you have the engineers. They know what's happening to these structures, right? They have a general idea of the schedule even, maybe not the order of events, but they know about how long everything's gonna take. They know what's gonna happen. So you wanna talk with the engineering team really early on. If you are the engineering team, if you're here today, you're gonna be talking to the biologists early on. You're gonna be figuring out like, okay, what's happening to this bridge or these bridges? Again, this could be for large projects with multiple bridges or single bridge projects. And then this provides really clear direction for everyone, right? Everyone knows what they're getting into. The plan outlines like, this is what you're gonna do with this structure. This is the time of year you may or may not be restricted. These are the kinds of things that you can and can't do at these times. But then it still allows for flexibility. I've had some projects where we had this plan and then there was a change in the schedule. The contractor's like, oh, we really need to actually start pile driving a little earlier to meet this thing. And I said, look, okay, it's a really long bridge, right? The bats are over here. Or no, they were in 2 places. So we ended up deciding that we would just have the bats in one area of the bridge so that they had more latitude at the other end. And so we just like kicked the bats, we provided more habitat over by the river. We kicked them out over here. They moved in over there. And then it gave the contractor the option to start at the one abutment and start pile driving and move closer. And by the time they got closer to the bats, they were outside of the maternity season. And so we were able to do that. And that was just, hey, this is what's happening. Communication, right? It's key. So they said, this is what we need to do. Can we do this? All right, let's talk about it. Let's talk to the agency. We needed, our bat plans are approved by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife before they're implemented because they're tied to our permits, our 1600 permits. And so they have to sign off on any written variation to what's in the plan. So we had to submit, an email just like, hey, this is what we're planning to do. This is why we're planning to do it. Is this okay? They email their concurrence, and then the contractor can move forward with this new, plan, which again, in this case involved installing some new habitat, kicking the bats out of this one area. Then they stayed in that other area during all of construction. And then when they were done, this was a widening project. They reopened the other one, the bats moved back in. We did our post-construction monitoring. The bats are using the bridge as they were before construction. I would call that success. And so, just an example of how, it gives you a clear plan and it's somewhat in stone, but it's not like fully in stone. You can still change things if you need to. One really important thing is to write these plans and have them work well. You need to have a bat biologist who has significant knowledge of the bat natural history and who's familiar with construction projects. The more construction knowledge, the better, because like things like the seismic retrofit, you have to be able to understand the process of construction, what activities create a lot of noise that could disturb the bats and what activities don't. And this is something I've learned anyone can learn it, but it takes a lot of time to learn. And I like to work with other biologists and other consulting companies because it helps their learning curves, right? They bring me onto their project, we do the project together. And at the end of it, they're just like, wow, I feel like I learned a lot more by working with you, which is how I learned. I learned from my mentors. I'm standing on the shoulders of, the ones before me. So having this will will prevent lots of problems. I also, because of my experience, I get brought in a lot to clean up messes. And it's very frustrating for me. The bats often are the biggest losers. I get brought in on projects where the bats we're not able to adequately mitigate the loss of habitat because bridge has already been designed, everything's done. They're already like starting construction. And then they were like, oh, wait, hold on. And then I get brought in, it's like some of these messes, like you can't clean up. Some of them you can, it's expensive, it's time consuming. And so just having this taken care of in advance is just so important. I can't emphasize that enough. So at any rate, that's all I have here. I'm happy to take questions. You can nail me down in the break too. Yeah. Just what we're using for questions.
Questions? Yeah.
This is a small room.
So it sounds like these management strategies where it seems there's a tie to the permit, because I feel like in the state that I'm at, we have Wyoming. It's very, very, very short construction season, so like timing stipulations are just a non-trivial thing at all for that. So it's kind of a little bit more than just these talking about. So for California, are there more teeth to say that you can't do these things to minimize effects on that, or is it like Wyoming game fish is really not that?
Yeah, it's complicated in California. Wow, this microphone's way different. So we have the California Environmental Quality Act, for those who aren't familiar with CEQA. And so there are more stringent overall environmental regulations in California. Maternity colonies are protected under CEQA as native wildlife nursery sites. And so you have to, as part of the law, you have to assess impacts to native wildlife nursery sites, and then you have to mitigate them to be less than significant. And so that's for maternity colonies. We also have the Fish and Game Code, which section 4150 prevents prohibits take of individual bats. Now that's not enforced. So it's not like they're going on and checking on that, but like it's something that we can use in our language when we're preparing documents where it's like, hey, you need to take all reasonable efforts to minimize take, which would be like evicting bats from an area so that they don't die. But there's no requirement to necessarily provide them habitat, as opposed to a maternity colony where you would need to mitigate and create new roosting habitat if the roosting habitat's destroyed to avoid having significant effects. So yeah, so it's a little tricky for other states. I know that a big part of, in California, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, different offices have more awareness too. And so the bats don't always get into the permits. And so there's like ICOET, they don't always get addressed under ICOET because not everybody's aware of bats when they're preparing their ICOET documents. And then even with the 1600 agreements, the CDFW staff's not always aware. Sometimes they'll just throw in bat measures just because they are sort of aware. And that's where I come in and I'm like, okay, we can like change these measures. But I don't know, in some of those states where, I mean, we're probably going to get some listed bats, but not in the next 4 years. So yeah, but we are, I mean, there is a push, and that I think will change things. But yeah, unfortunately in states like that, I'm not sure what to say for that. I mean, you can try to do it, you can put it into things and see, but yeah, it's a tough one. I'm not sure how to deal with that. California's got a special situation.
Any other burning? There's one more.
Do your mitigation plans cover water quality? We have important foraging sites in water quality.
Mine don't, but there's no reason for them not to. I actually had a project where the Army Corps required water quality monitoring for as part of the project, and I was also checking on the roost. So we just had them both folded into the same plan. So there's no reason you can put other things in. I mean, you don't want the document to get unwieldy, but like we have nesting bird plans, which are very similar to this. And those are separate documents because it's like, it'd be a massive document. But yeah, you could do that for sure.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, thank you.